Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. In this video, I want to do a simple drawing lesson talking about how we draw monsters or creatures. I think these simple aberrations of the traditional human form are really interesting. It's something that I've been working a lot on over my career, drawing orcs and goblins and all sorts of, creepy crawly things. I think it's one of the most, fun things to do, to draw these sorts of things from imagination. The trick is, how do we get there? How do we sort of apply a lot of the concepts that you might find in a traditional how to draw book or education, such as, this one that I'm often talking about, Andrew Loomis's How to Draw the Head and Hands. And how do we sort of apply that to something that might be more fun or exciting to you? It doesn't necessarily have to be monsters or orcs, but what I want to talk about is both how we can apply that to different subject matters and how important it is for you to find subjects for you to practice drawing and understand how to experiment and practice with your foundational concepts like rendering and perspective and form drawing as you're drawing fun stuff that you actually want to draw. Anyway, let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome again to the Drawing Codex. My name's Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, like orcs and monsters and creatures and all sorts of other things. And we're all about embracing the challenge of drawing, working on our foundation but making it fun. And we're all about comics and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you want to learn more about line and color illustration, you can check out my free quick start guide. I go over the basics of how to get up and running quickly in Photoshop and how to think about developing your own simple, reliable process in the line and color style. I go over starting from a thumbnail, going all the way to the finished image, and you can get the PSDs and the brushes and everything else that I use to create most of the work that I create day in, day out. Go check it out. The link will be in the description. Okay, so if you've seen a lot of the other videos that I've got on the channel which talk about foundation and how important it is to build a good understanding of perspective and anatomy, and how you can use a lot of the concepts in the Andrew Loomis books or other similar books, you can often, understand how to apply those things to a simple human figure. But I think it's really, really important to understand how you can take control of those and draw stuff that you actually want. Now, I'm going to be drawing some monsters and orcs and things like that in this video. You don't necessarily have to do that. What I'm mostly going to talk about is the idea of taking the same ideas that we would have for building, a standard human figure, and being able to play with them and modify them and use them for our own needs. Anyway, let's jump over to the drawing table and we'll get started. All right, here we are at the drawing table. Now, I want to talk a little bit about building reference and maybe where you might get your ideas for modifying some of the basic human features that you would find. I think that, again, there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can go and look at, this is just a Pinterest board that I've sort of made it's a mix of some art that I think is really interesting and cool, and some sort of movie stills, and mostly what I'm doing when I'm making these, I think this one is just for sort of goblins and orcs and that sort of stuff. And I think it can be a really, really good way to do that, to just think about, hey, what is out there? What is the baseline that I'm trying to create? In the beginning, I think just getting to a baseline and being able to modify the form is more important than you coming up with your own ideas. But ultimately, if you are interested in the ideas of concept design and creating your own things, that's when you have to get more creative about how you actually modify these things and move beyond, just sort of copying someone else's ideas or someone else's designs. But in the beginning, I think one of the best exercises you can do, if you're sort of thinking about monsters and you're kind of saying, hey, I just want to be able to draw an orc. Don't mix up the concept of creativity and, you becoming the next avant-garde designer with learning to draw. It's really important to have a good intent going forward and understand, are you learning to draw? Are you learning to design? or are you actually sort of executing on those things and doing a really good drawing, or coming up with a really good design? Those are completely different things, and if you try and do too many of them in the beginning, you're going to find it challenging if you don't have all of those skills working perfectly in the beginning. So mostly what I'm going to use this for is just to kind of get a baseline, so you kind of know where I'm going with a lot of this and you understand the basic idea. But I'm not trying to come up with some amazing new design. We're just talking about how to draw well. Now, this skill is really important. And what we're kind of going to do is take a lot of the ideas that, again, I would have learnt in a book like, Drawing the Head and Hands by Andrew Loomis, where we think of the head as a three-dimensional object and we have kind of systems and ways of building it. This is often referred to as the quote-unquote Loomis Method, and I have a lot of videos sort of explaining, demystifying, and showing how I actually use this day to day when I'm drawing comics, which is, again, the actual sort of end goal for me is not to be able to draw this type of stuff, even though I think this is a great book. My goal is often to draw fantasy comics and things like that. And again, I had a lot of sort of characters, like the Maluk character that I've talked about before on the channel, which, essentially are sort of a goblin monster character. So mostly what we want to do today here in this video is talk about what are the, fundamental underlying drawing concepts that go into creating either a character like this or a character that is pretty similar. Again, because it's not a demonstration talking about design, I'm just gonna, be using fairly standard tropes that you're gonna find when it comes to drawing these sorts of fantasy monsters or orcs, and we'll talk about how you can modify some of those base face shapes and get things going. The first thing we need to start with is probably just the basic idea of how do we think about the Loomis method for a human. And again, there's lots of other sort of videos that we've got on the channel talking about that, but mostly what you're dealing with is a set of simple proportions. And what we want to do as we draw monsters and other sort of things that are a little bit more interesting is modify those proportions. So let's look at how that works and look at how we can sort of think about and add form drawing to that. So again, in my case, I've got my sphere. We're going to cut off a bit of the sphere, and this gives us some basic static proportions that sort of divide up the face. So we're going to have the nose in here, right? We're going to have the eyes here. The mouth is going to be somewhere down there, and then we're going to have some cheekbones. And that's kind of how we sort of start off the basic proportions. And then there's obviously form that sort of goes on top of that. And then we sort of get something that is going to look a little bit like a face. So what we want to do when we deal with monsters is take a very, very similar idea, but what we're going to do is sort of either combine other form language, i.e. things that you might find from animals, or just, potentially things which are exaggerations of emotion that you might see on a human character. So, one of the things you're often sort of finding about like sort of orcs or monsters or things like that is that they're sort of accentuating the sort of expression or the feeling of emotion. And what we're doing is sort of hard coding that into the character design. And this is often where, again, it's not just a matter of sort of, modifying form necessarily and, just doing it for no reason. Often what we'll kind of find is that, again, like some of the characters here, the features that we're designing and the form that we kind of design is meant to sort of give the character a slightly more animalistic expression and slightly more animalistic form. Now, again, that delves a little bit more into the design side of things, which is probably, time for a different video, but gives you a little bit of an idea for sort of what we're doing. Mostly what we're doing is modifying the proportions, right? Proportions, right? And form. And we're doing that to, sort of mix with sort of animals, right, that have sort of, significance to us, that we either kind of have an emotional connection to, them being sort of powerful or more sort of, primitive or sort of harder to understand. And again, that's still 3. Yeah, and just sort of trying to mix all of those concepts up. So it's often just a matter of thinking about what animals or what expressions are you really trying to sort of get across. So one of the major things that's often happening with the idea of sort of orcs or, other sort of monsters like that is that we are taking the idea of a human and we're kind of mixing it a little bit with the ape, right, or the monkey. And again, that's because that has a feeling of sort of lesser intelligence and sort of less evolution than humans from the human sort of psyche. And so we're going to tend to see those features that you're going to see in, again, an ape as being slightly more sort of primitive, right? Which again is the basic sort of design language of an orc. So it's also more animalistic, right? We're going to see much more of a sort of exaggerated set of teeth. And again, the feeling of teeth also make the character feel a lot more animalistic. And again, less like humans who, don't have those big sort of carnivore teeth. So again, it's often just about thinking through these things and then thinking about how we modify that form. So again, one of the things we're going to do is look at how do we sort of modify this feeling of where the teeth are underneath here. And then how do we modify the major sort of points of the skeleton. And that really is about it. It's just a matter of saying, well, which bits do we make bigger? Which bits do we make smaller? How do we change these? Now, the reason I sort of mentioned design is that often, again, if you don't think about why particular sort of orcs or designs work, then it can be hard to it can be very challenging to modify them further and get something that works. And this can be a real challenge that you have to work with, and why I would recommend just modifying one of these variables at a time. If you're still learning to draw, then let's worry a little bit more about the drawing side of it than the design side of it. And it could be a good idea to just pick some Warcraft orcs or one of the Peter Jackson Tolkien sort of orcs or something like that already exists, and just sort of practice your drawing based on that. Not to the point where you're copying it, but just where you pick up the basic fundamental reasons that it works. So again, it's not necessarily a matter of, just rote copying it and trying to sort of focus on getting it right. And if you fail, getting upset because you don't get it right. But obviously there's many different ways to kind of solve this problem and create characters that feel hyper emotional because they're taking parts of our sort of anatomy or expression set or psyche and kind of, really amping them up. And if you sort of go along a certain set of tracks that other people have set up for that, I think it means that as you modify things, you might be a little bit sort of better off, and that'll be an easier path. The more that you try and sort of, do all of these things at once, as I keep saying, the harder of a time you will have, and potentially, that can be sort of very frustrating. So again, one of the things that we're often sort of doing with these fantasy concepts and monsters is trying to evoke emotion. So the character kind of evokes emotion because it feels sort of part animal, part human. And again, that sort of, is something that's interesting for us to look at. So let's look at this as a basic place that we want to go, some sort of orc monster character, and I call it a monster just because, again, it's the same set of skills that you would probably use to draw an orc or, you know, some type of fantasy character as you would probably take to draw, again, something that was a little bit sort of scarier or more monsterish. So what we're doing here is essentially taking the same idea, and you see me do, if you looked at other videos on the channel, you see me do a very similar version of this construction when I'm sort of explaining how you can modify the Loomis method. But what we're doing is probably taking the most of the skull. We're not worrying about, you know, sort of making it very big. And what we're going to do is give more of that ape-like sort of animalistic sort of nose. And again, part of this is not necessarily just sort of it's not necessarily the like the anatomy of it that's going to give it that feeling. It's not a matter of it just sort of being bigger or a particular shape. It's often also the degree to which the nostrils are going to feel sort of flared, which is often something that we associate with emotion or anger. When someone's nostrils flare, regardless of anatomy, it's something that you can kind of notice as a change. And so it's one of these things where often if you're trying to make this kind of fierce character that's meant to be worrying to people, that you're going to focus on, again, making the nostrils flare a little bit more. And the other thing we're going to do is give some really kind of like solid cheekbones. And that just, again, allows like really good protection of the eyes. And what we're going to do then is think about, so this is very similar to the Loomis construction, but what we're going to do is change the side to side movement here. And by that I mean, if we think about the profile, what we've got here is the skull, and then we've got a nose, and instead of going straight down like we would for our human figure, what we're going to do is enlarge the sort of teeth there. So if you were to think about the skull that's happening under there, what we've got is a very sort of large, much more animalistic skull, potentially with big sort of tusk teeth, which again don't make a lot of sense from a practical standpoint for this type of character, but again just seems to be one of the tropes, which again is why I'd suggest just going with that if you're practicing. So what we're after is to, if we think about if this is the line that would go down and would be a sort of a normal human, what we're after is expressing this much more exaggerated set of teeth. We're interested in, you know, representing that in this dimension. And so what we really need to think about is what's happening on a basic structural level when we do that. There's a lot of different processes you can use. One of the things I often like doing is just a simple exercise where we do draw this line. We think about this as the center line, right? And I've got the center line for the nose, and then we got the center line for the mouth, and we're just going to exaggerate that. And then what I'm going to do is draw a line that sort of represents where this mouth would go. Now, these things are all really requiring quite a bit of understanding of that basic form. And this is where you do need to experiment a lot and play around with it so that you can figure out which of these marks you make first and how you kind of figure it out. Again, what I'm often doing, which is what I'm often talking about when it comes to utilizing the sort of Loomis stuff, is that he really talks about in a lot of his books like efficiency and what is the most effective way to kind of plan things out. That really is what the Loomis method is focused on. So a primary thing I'm doing here is just for my own sake trying to be more efficient, which is not always what you want from an educational standpoint, but that's what I'm trying to find. Now, from a very simplistic structural standpoint, what we kind of have with the skull is you kind of have the skull bit that is contains the brain case, which is, can be whatever shape you want, right? It's much more of like an egg shape if we look from the side here. And again, let's make this a little bit more three-dimensional. So we've got, looking at that from the front, right? And then we've got that line that we're dropping down. And normally, right, the skull's got some kind of, it's got a nose here, which we're going to make, again, sort of a lot bigger. And we're going to have some eye sockets. Now, the other major thing that the actual sort of bit with your brain in it is in, again, my medical anatomy is not great, is it has the top teeth. But that's how you would necessarily think about it, from like, oh, this is this bit and that's this bit. Probably it's better to think about from a design standpoint, the skull as being this sort of brain case plus the jaw, which comes down from the side and is going to have a point. Right, if we get our little skull, which is lying around here somewhere. There we go. So we've sort of got our brain case here, which again for our orc is going to be, a little bit smaller compared to a giant jaw and teeth. And what we need to think about is this point here of the jaw here, and the front of it here. Right, so we're kind of building this framework here. And then what we have is essentially like another giant ball in here. Right, so we can think about, and this is often a really good way to think about the human face, is that we have a giant sort of mound of the mouth that we draw. And it's actually really important to draw that in that way, because we often want to do a version of this where we think very much about the mouth as being curving around a spherical object as opposed to just drawn flat on. So it can actually be a really good thing to do to draw, so we can put that there, have a similar thing. That can really, like drawing that in and thinking about the mound here, it's actually a really good idea to play around with exaggerations of the form like this, even if maybe you're not interested in orcs or whatever, because it allows you to sort of experiment and exaggerate these things and sort of see like, oh, if I push it really far, this is what happens. And I think it's often, that stuff that allows you to, do the subtlety when you're actually drawing a more sort of normal, realistic face. It's often like the really nice interplay that you find between people who have a good grasp of realism and a good grasp of caricature. Frank Frazetta was one of those artists who, classically had a really good sense of caricature and, realism. And when he combined them, the work that he did often had a good sense of both. I'll just grab one of those books so we can see and talk about that simple concept. All right, so here I've got a book and we can sort of illustrate this point nicely. And I think this is a really important point to understand about, how different skills can, really help other sort of areas of art in ways that might be not obvious. So again, Frank Frazetta is mostly known for this type of hyper sort of aggressive, dynamic, more realistic painted illustration where, often we're sort of illustrating a lot of action, a lot of energy, a lot of ferocity. But I think it's often misunderstood that, again, he was just into this. And I think you can see by a lot of other artists trying to mimic this, that they were never able to quite get there. They were never able to quite make it look in, quite as aggressive. I think a lot of that is down to the fact that he spent a large portion of his career also drawing very cartoony, humorous strips. And he had that ability to exaggerate and push the form. He spent a lot of his career actually drawing sort of, funny animal comics, because that's just what he did before he sort of started drawing a lot of this stuff and became very well known for this. And I think it's sort of this mixed with his, general drawing ability and ability to just get a likeness and, really paint what he sees, that kind of allows this sort of work to really shine and I think sort of push past, the other artists who are kind of trying to do a similar thing. You often have to sort of push things and experiment to then go back and find the middle ground. And I think that's a great way that I've sort of, used these ideas to kind of help myself. And again, I think this is the same idea we've got here. It's important to be able to exaggerate the form, and you think about, like, how do we make this bigger? How do we make this smaller? What do we do? How do we exaggerate? It's really important to be able to do that, so that when you come back to drawing, very sort of, much more mundane subjects, that you've got that experience to kind of maybe just push the lips, make them a little bit bigger. You've been there and worked on that skill. So this really is often what we're talking about. We've got the basic Loomis construction that, again, you can check out elsewhere on the channel or, read the Loomis books about. And what we're doing is just modifying a lot of these basic proportions here. And the other thing that we're doing is kind of working with, again, exaggerating some of those expressions and feelings of aggression, as we were saying. But this is really the best way to think about it. Think about it as a sphere, right? We're going to have, again, some sort of eyes. And obviously that's where the line would normally be dropped. But the main thing to consider is, what happens to... Right, so we can think about these as being sort of joined up. Now, again, I'm just kind of drawing these in random space, but obviously if we were to drop a line right down the bottom, we can think directly about where this jaw and that jaw, right, is going to be. Again, drop a line down the center. Right, think about this from a basic structural standpoint. Right, we have a sphere. Let's drop a line down the middle of it, and let's drop a line down the front. Okay, this is where we're going to have the chin. Let's draw a line back. Boom. All right, that's an important line to find. Let's draw some lines through, and now I'm going to draw a line down the back. And what this is doing is essentially drawing this line, right, or this line. All right. Boom. Boom. So now I've got the side here, and we've got the chin, right, two sides of the chin, and then we sort of connect the dots. Let's take this sort of general size and we'll estimate it over there, and then draw that. Right, so we've got this line, this line, this line, and this line. Boom, 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 boom. And that really is what we're trying to find. Now, again, you can guesstimate that or get better at drawing it. But it's these things that make up the basic structure that we can modify. As I said here, right, we've got the same basic concept, but I've really pushed this jaw out. Right, so again, the jaw is getting big. It's like a Tyrannosaurus Rex or something, right? We've just got this massive jaw, which is just going to feel like it's going to be there for eating you, right? It just has that sort of gigantic, sort of chunky look, right? It's like someone like Dwayne Johnson, the Rock, or something similar, right? They have that sort of like massive sort of anatomical structure around the jaw. We can push that, right? And then that has that kind of real feeling of strength. And then what we do, again, is sort of think about massing out this sort of sphere that's going to be the teeth. Now, again, I'm doing a lot of form drawing stuff here that, again, you will be limited in if you haven't spent a lot of time form drawing, but hopefully this gives you some reasons to play around with and experiment when it comes to just getting good at sort of drawing spheres and finding dimensionality in spheres, And again, some of these other concepts, right? Like just start with the simple idea of what we're trying to do when you're drawing the jaw, right? Is you're just trying to draw something very similar to this. And what's happening there, if we go back to our model, which is probably what I should have done in the first place to make that a lot clearer, right? We've got this line here, and we've got the same on the other side. So if we look at that from above, we've got this kind of box like this, right? That's what we're trying to draw there. Bump, 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 and then we've got the sides coming up. Now, obviously, they're tilted and there's subtlety to it, but we can change that, right? The most important thing is just to think about these and then finding that mound in the middle. So there's that. This is the structure we're sort of trying to find. Again, there's many different ways, as I was explaining there, that you can do it more efficiently without drawing a bunch of lines in, but this relies a lot more on visualization. So the next thing that we're doing is kind of thinking about what does that mound of teeth from a structural standpoint, how does that work? How does that fit? So we're typically going to have, again, some sort of animalistic version of this where we're going to exaggerate what's happening with those teeth. But what we can do initially is just, think about where those teeth are. And let's do a super simple version of it. There. All right, I've got teeth up here, teeth down there, and then I've just got some giant sort of tusk teeth coming up. Obviously, there can be some more teeth here. Now, you don't often actually end up drawing, lots of these teeth, and you could certainly draw a more realistic set of teeth. You can look up teeth reference. The most important thing from a drawing perspective is just be able to wrap them around this shape. How many teeth they are, exactly what the spacing is, etc. You can look at reference for that. From a drawing perspective, it is just getting this feeling that, again, the teeth are this horseshoe shape, right? And that they kind of line up with each other. Once you get them to line up with each other, then it's very easy to, we can add some vampire style teeth, right? We can, modify them. We can sort of change them. It all starts with that first step, being able to think about where they are. And again, you might need to sort of actually draw them in the first few times, right? So we can think about the same thing that's kind of happening there. We can sort of draw that in to begin with. We can think about where that center line is, right? Where these teeth might be underneath there, right? What exactly is happening, and then you can just erase all of that and not worry about it, and just kind of draw the teeth that you want. It's totally up to you. In the beginning, the more you can draw through and figure out where all those things are, erase it out, then only redraw in the teeth you want, the easier it is. So hopefully, again, here's some basic concepts and ideas that talk about how we modify that. There's really no better way to sort of learn these things than experimenting yourself and playing around with the basic forms. See if you can keep them in proportion. See if you can draw some of these basic components of the skull. Again, the brain case, we have the jaw, and then we've got the sort of mound of the mouth. Those are the main things that we're going to sort of squash and stretch from a large sort of proportional point of view. But the next thing we'll do is just do a little demo, and we'll put a few of these things together, and we'll talk again about the concepts of expression and emotion and how often what we're doing is trying to amp those up. Hopefully you can see some of those same concepts here with the Maluk character. I'll just quickly sort of demonstrate again how that sort of tends to work with his sort of structural breakdown. Again, there's going to be a sphere for a head with that character, and his forehead really sort of slopes backwards. He has that nose. If we think about the center line that would drop there, that would sort of make up the normal figure. what we have for him is that this kind of really goes down there. And if we think about the jaw, his jaw actually kind of tends to slope forward a little bit. Right, and we get a structure that looks a little bit like this. And then he obviously has these big sort of tusk teeth that come up like that. So that's sort of what's going on with, you know, his basic character, although again it's a little bit different. But in many cases it's just about adjusting these features and playing around. So you can see again with the exaggerated expression there, again, one of the things we're, you know, sort of trying to do is make him feel like he's frowning or sort of angry and sort of build that into his character design a little bit. Let's look again at how we can sort of, you know, add those things and once we've got that structure there, make something that is a little bit more interesting. So again, let's build that structure. Again, at this point I'm just following the Loomis method, placing in the brain case. And what we're going to do is just change up maybe the size of the brow. And we're going to think about this center line, as I said. So typically what you'll see me do as I play around with this is just put in a few markers. So the first is just to think about where that center line is going. So I'm going to mass in a sense for where the nose might go. Again, this is not structural, it's kind of just placement. But this helps me sort of think where that is going to go. And then, again, if we look at this from the side, what I'm sort of doing is saying, well, there's kind of a nose here, right? And then this is coming out here. And then what I want to sort of figure out is like, how big are these? How big are these teeth, right? What is going on there? So that's where I'm going to think about this. But we could also, again, as I said, sort of mass in that form. That could be sort of useful. And then try and define, in the same way we did for the head, we try and define similar sort of dimensionality there. Then I'm going to think about, again, the same sort of concept that you would see with the skull, where from the bottom of those teeth we go down and then we find the chin. So we're going to come out here. And this is where, again, from a structural standpoint, I'm just going to roughly put in some of these marks and see how we go. Boom, boom. And again, let's push out that jaw as I was playing around with before. Right, if that's going there. Again, I don't really need to find it over here. That will be enough. But you can see here I'm getting the structure. I'm also going to think about, you know, how wide those cheekbones are going to be. And again, I find it sort of quite useful to sort of just rough in where I think those eyes are going to be. We can then think about, you know, adding some form of ears or something like that. Maybe slightly smaller. Because again, the small ears will make the rest of the character feel a lot bigger. And then I'm just going to indicate in, again, this big sort of orc monster character neck. And indicate again where some of those traps are going to be. All right, so we're using structural drawing and we're just modifying that idea of the Loomis method that you can see there in a lot of those basic Loomis books. So if we get those back, you can see we are essentially just looking at some of these concepts. And if you look at the Loomis book, again, he talks very much about these concepts that you can, you know, use very much in your own character design and stuff. It's not as if I'm sort of making up a lot of these concepts from scratch. This is just sort of talking about how we can apply it to drawing sort of fun stuff. But all of these ideas are, you know, very much part of the book and part of the system and part of most, you know, traditional how to draw stuff, what we're doing is just modifying those basic forms there. So again, just keep that in mind. We're not doing anything sort of special. So again, I've got my center line. Let's think about where there's some teeth. And again, you might want to put a lot of these in. All right. Or, look at some actual teeth reference. I'm just sort of making this up. And again, we're going to go with our standard sort of orc idea. But it can pay to sort of think about where the skeleton is if you're doing this for the first time. But what I'm going to have is some big tusks. And I'm sort of imagining where that one is going to come from. Again, I'm sort of taking it across. I'm sort of imagining where that wraps around, right? I think it's somewhere around there. And I think that's probably similar to what we've got. And what I'm going to do is think about where the lips are going to go. Now, again, there's a lot of different ways you can sort of play around with this and figure out, how the lips might sort of move. Again, they do it sort of differently for, sort of Warhammer orcs or Warcraft orcs, right? All of these things are kind of a little bit different. Mostly, again, we're talking about the structure and just sort of thinking about the drawing. So here, I'm really thinking about this as if it's kind of a rubber band and thinking about constructing different elements of the face there. So we've sort of got the lips that are wrapping around there, and we've got the teeth, and then again I've got my center line, which helps keep me honest in terms of that sort of structure. Boom, boom. Got my big sort of jaw, and I've got my big cheekbones, massing them out. I've got this nose. And now let's look at, again, how we think about the sort of expression side of it. So we're going to add more sort of mass towards the forehead there, really sort of crunch that up. And draw in that sort of nose. And so again, there's also a video on the channel about drawing noses and how we can think about that from a structural standpoint. What I might do is, do some follow-up videos to this, as I often talk about, where maybe we focus a little bit more on, how to sort of finish it off, add rendering, do those kind of steps. Maybe we can sort of add some color in Photoshop. For now, again, I just want to leave it from a structural standpoint, how we kind of do this. Again, elongate the face, build out this proportion. Got some teeth there. Again, sort of gums here, very exposed gums. Probably be uncomfortable. Got this nose, again, trying to make it feel as if it's kind of like a bit sort of tense. And we're just going to add that kind of compression to the forehead. Let's think about, again, what's happening with this ear. And again, how we blend these forms of the cheekbones into everything else. It's obviously going to be some hair of some kind. Well, again, I'm normally doing the typical sort of orcish top knot sort of hair. And here again, we can think about adding some eyes that are very, again, like sort of a little bit sort of angry or sort of fierce, right? When people are frowning, they have a lot of sort of compression there. And that's a lot of what that sort of monster design is about, right? Sort of building those things in. Like a dolphin often, looks like it's always smiling. Some things look like they're sort of always, cute. Some things look like they're always angry. The idea is that a lot of these things look, should look and feel as if they're, they have their sort of, sort of essence displayed on their face, right? Because they're not necessarily something that's going to express a lot of emotion, which is why that's often a real challenge when they try and make these kind of Warcraft movies, right? Where they give these kind of characters that are sort of designed to look fierce and try and make them have all these sort of different emotions and stuff. That was a real challenge. Yeah, and I think there's obvious reasons why that was a real challenge. But yeah, so hopefully that gives you an idea for kind of how we combine a lot of these concepts together, how we think about that. So what I'm doing again is sort of adding mass to that sort of forehead, feeling like it's sort of compressed, and I'm following these lines, right? Sort of these, right, expression lines. A good way to think about it, a good way to practice is, right, just think about sort of drawing forms, and then think about how to, add dimensionality to those forms, right? So it's just a bit of extra sort of skin that's sort of just being folded up, and that's really all that's happening. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea for how we do this. What I'd recommend, again, if you're sort of interested in exploring these ideas, is just play around. Again, I'll do plenty more demos sort of explaining this basic concept as we progress, because I think it's super interesting to see all of these things working again and again with slight sort of modifications. But the best thing to do is just experiment with it. See if you can modify, see if you can exaggerate. And I think if you are on this journey to really improve your overall drawing, this actually is a really, really good way of doing it, because as I said, if you can really, really push things and make them super exaggerated, then it becomes a lot easier later on to just kind of dial that back and make it more reasonable. So I would often say it's actually easier to kind of go and push things in and really modify them than it is to just do a little bit of it. And that's what I'd recommend. So when you're doing this, go for broke. Put in giant teeth. Put in giant sort of furious noses. Think about things which are sort of scary, like bared teeth. Again, people who are upset at you. Animalistic things, again, sort of big teeth, bared sort of teeth. Animals that we have sort of an emotional response to. You could make the forehead feel like that kind of lion, sort of a feline look. You could add in some other sort of anatomy. Again, these are all things that we could sort of practice in the future and make some more videos about. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see those, or if there's any of these things that aren't clear that we could sort of experiment with more and more. But again, my goal with these is to just sort of demonstrate how this is sort of done, and through that we can talk about some of these basic drawing concepts, and hopefully again all get better as artists and all improve our foundation. That's all I've got for this one though. Let me know in the comments again whether this was useful, whether you'd like to see anything similar or different. Other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.